Before we talk about Gatsby, we need to confront a more uncomfortable possibility. What if the most dangerous dreams are not the ones that fail, but the ones that keep us moving? Most readers are taught that the green light is a symbol of hope. A beacon. A promise. Something noble shining across the darkness. But what if that interpretation is only half the story? What if the reason this image has survived for nearly a century is not because it represents hope, but because it exposes a contradiction at the center of human existence? Think about it. Why does a tiny light, barely visible in the distance, become more memorable than mansions, wealth, status, or even the people surrounding it? Why does our attention return, again and again, to a single point glowing across dark water? Because the green light is not really an object. It is a psychological force. And the moment you see it that way, the entire meaning of Gatsby begins to shift. At first glance, the light appears to represent desire. Something wanted. Something pursued. But desire is rarely about the thing itself. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to transform ordinary goals into symbols of salvation. We convince ourselves that happiness exists just beyond the next achievement. The next promotion. The next relationship. The next version of ourselves. The future becomes sacred. And suddenly, a question emerges. What if the true power of the green light has nothing to do with what it promises, and everything to do with the distance it creates? That distance matters. Because a dream that remains far away can never be tested. It can never disappoint us. It can never reveal whether it was worth pursuing in the first place. In that sense, the green light occupies a strange role. It acts less like a destination and more like a mechanism. A machine that generates meaning. As long as it remains beyond reach, it keeps the dream alive. And that is where the mystery begins. Because the figure at the center of this story is often described as a dreamer. But dreamers are rarely motivated by reality. They are motivated by possibility. By imagined futures. By worlds that exist more vividly in the mind than they ever could in life. This creates a paradox. The very thing that gives a person purpose may also prevent them from being present. The very thing that inspires movement may also guarantee dissatisfaction. And suddenly the green light starts looking less like a reward and more like a warning. A warning about what happens when the future becomes more important than the present. Picture the image for a moment. A hand reaching into darkness. A small green glow across black water. Not close enough to touch. Not bright enough to fully understand. Just visible enough to keep pulling someone forward. That image survives because it belongs to all of us. Not just to one character. Not just to one novel. Every generation creates its own green lights. Success. Recognition. Wealth. Reinvention. The belief that fulfillment exists somewhere ahead, waiting patiently for our arrival. But here is the question that makes Fitzgerald's final image so unsettling. What if we need those distant lights in order to move forward? And what if believing in them is also the reason we never truly arrive? If the green light represents a future that never fully arrives, then we have to ask a deeper question: why are human beings so willing to organize their entire lives around things they cannot possess? Because the conflict at the heart of this story is not between success and failure. It is between reality and idealization. Those are not the same thing. Reality deals with what exists. Idealization deals with what we wish existed. And once something becomes idealized, it stops behaving like an ordinary goal. It becomes untouchable. Protected. Elevated beyond criticism. We no longer see the thing itself, we see the meaning we have attached to it. That distinction changes everything. The figure standing at the center of this story is often remembered as someone pursuing a dream. But dreams are rarely dangerous on their own. What becomes dangerous is the transformation of a dream into an identity. The moment a person begins to believe that one future outcome will finally make life complete, that future gains extraordinary power. Not because it is real. Because it feels necessary. And that creates a Contradiction most people never notice. The more meaning we invest in a destination, the less capable we become of evaluating it honestly. Think about the way people talk about success. Not success they have achieved, but success they imagine. It always appears cleaner from a distance. More complete. More satisfying. The future becomes a blank screen onto which every hope can be projected. In psychological terms, this is remarkably powerful. In human terms, it can be devastating. Because reality has limits. Fantasy does not. And fantasy almost always wins the comparison. That may be why the most haunting image in this story is not wealth, status, or achievement. It is distance. A stretch of dark water separating a person from what they desire. A gap that seems small enough to cross, yet somehow remains permanent. Distance becomes the symbol. Not the object on the other side. This is where the green light begins to reveal a second layer of meaning. It is not merely a symbol of longing. It is a symbol of projection. The light glows because the mind keeps feeding it significance. The farther away it remains, the easier it becomes to imagine perfection. And now another mystery emerges. What happens when someone finally reaches the thing they have spent years idealizing? Most stories tell us that fulfillment follows. Life suggests something different. People achieve careers they once dreamed about. They reach financial milestones. They earn recognition. They obtain the very thing they believed would transform everything. Yet an unsettling pattern often appears. The feeling fades. A new target emerges. Another distant light begins to glow on the horizon. The pursuit survives even when the object changes. Which suggests something extraordinary. Maybe the true attachment was never to the dream itself. Maybe it was to the act of dreaming. Now the scale of the conflict begins to expand. This is no longer a question about one individual or one era. It becomes a question about entire societies. Economies grow because people believe tomorrow will be better than today. Industries are built on aspiration. Cultures celebrate ambition. Entire generations are taught to keep reaching toward the next milestone. In other words, civilization may depend on the same force symbolized by that tiny light across the water. A force that creates progress. A force that creates dissatisfaction. A force that inspires greatness while quietly ensuring that enough never feels like enough. And that leads us to a more unsettling possibility. What if the green light is neither a promise nor a warning? What if it is something far more complicated, a mechanism built into human nature itself? Because if our greatest achievements emerge from chasing distant visions, then the next question becomes impossible to ignore. How do you distinguish between a dream that gives life meaning and an illusion that slowly takes life away? If there is a danger hidden inside human ambition, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Why do we continue repeating the same pattern generation after generation? Because by now, a deeper contradiction has emerged. We often assume that illusions are weaknesses. We imagine that mature, rational people eventually outgrow them. But history tells a different story. Some of the most powerful movements ever created were built not on certainty, but on visions of a future that did not yet exist. Nations are built that way. Companies are built that way. Revolutions are built that way. Even personal identities are built that way. The future arrives twice. First as imagination. Then as reality. And that creates a problem. If every meaningful achievement begins as an illusion, how can we tell the difference between a necessary vision and a destructive fantasy? This is where the conflict becomes more complicated than simple optimism versus pessimism. The role of the distant light is not merely to deceive. It is also to organize human behavior. Think about what happens when people lose their sense of direction. Not direction on a map, but direction in life. The result is rarely freedom. More often, it is paralysis. Energy collapses. Motivation disappears. Meaning begins to erode. Human beings seem to require something beyond the horizon. Something to move toward. something to believe in. And yet the very mechanism that creates purpose can quietly become a trap. That is the contradiction. The same force that inspires growth can also create permanent dissatisfaction. The same dream that gives life structure can make the present feel inadequate. The same vision that fuels achievement can transform reality into a constant disappointment. Notice how often this pattern appears. A student believes fulfillment exists after graduation. A professional believes fulfillment exists after the next promotion. An entrepreneur believes fulfillment exists after financial success. The destination changes. The structure remains. A hand reaching through darkness. A small light in the distance. A promise that always seems one step further away. The memory fragment repeats itself because the psychological pattern repeats itself. But there is another layer hidden beneath this one. The figure at the center of this story is often interpreted as someone chasing an external goal. Yet the deeper conflict may not be external at all. What if the real pursuit is internal? What if the distant object matters less than the version of the self created by pursuing it? That possibility changes everything. Because then the dream is no longer a destination. It becomes an identity. And identities are far more difficult to abandon than goals. People can let go of opportunities. They can let go of possessions. They can even let go of relationships. But letting go of a story about who they believe themselves to be is much harder. Now the scale begins to expand again. This is no longer the psychology of one individual. It becomes the psychology of entire cultures. Modern society often encourages people to construct themselves around future achievements. To become someone. To arrive somewhere. To build a life that proves their value. The result is a civilization powered by aspiration. But civilizations built on aspiration face a hidden risk. What happens when people become more attached to the pursuit than to the truth? What happens when the image becomes more important than reality? What happens when symbols begin governing behavior more effectively than facts? At that point, the distant light is no longer a personal phenomenon. It becomes a social force. A force capable of shaping economies, institutions, and collective dreams. And here the mystery deepens. Because perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that people chase illusions. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that they need them. Not because they are foolish. Not because they are weak. But because meaning itself may depend on believing in something that always remains slightly out of reach. If that is true, then we are standing on the edge of a far more difficult question. What if the real tragedy is not failing to reach the light? What if the real tragedy begins the moment the light is finally close enough to touch? The possibility we arrived at in the last section forces us to confront a radically different interpretation. What if the distant light was never designed to be reached? What if its true function was something else entirely? This is where the symbol begins to reveal its deepest layer. Most people assume that meaning comes from possession. We tell ourselves that fulfillment arrives when the goal becomes reality. But the architecture of human motivation suggests something very different. Meaning is often generated not by arrival, but by movement. Not by having, but by reaching. That distinction may be the key to understanding why this image continues to haunt readers long after the details of the story begin to fade. The light is small. The water is dark. The distance remains. Those details matter because they transform a simple object into a permanent condition. A hand extending into darkness becomes more than an image. It becomes a model of human existence. Always reaching. Never fully arriving. And here a revelation begins to emerge. The central figure in this story is not important because of what he wants. He is important because he embodies a pattern that exists in all of us. His role is larger than an individual dreamer. He becomes a symbolic representative of humanity's relationship with the future. That is his influence. That is his legacy. And that is why the image survives. Because readers recognize something uncomfortable inside it. Not a character. Themselves. The deeper contradiction is that human beings often believe they are pursuing objects when they are actually pursuing meanings. Wealth is rarely about money alone. Status is rarely about recognition alone. Achievement is rarely about achievement alone. Beneath every visible pursuit exists an invisible desire. A desire for significance. A desire for permanence. A desire to believe that life is moving toward something that matters. The revelation is that the distant light functions as a container for those desires. It absorbs them, reflects them, magnifies them. And because every person projects something different into it, the symbol never becomes exhausted. One reader sees love. Another sees ambition. Another sees faith. Another sees self-deception. The symbol survives because it remains unfinished. Its meaning changes as we change. Now the scale expands once again. What begins as an individual longing becomes a civilizational force. Entire societies operate on projected futures. Markets depend on confidence. Institutions depend on belief. Political movements depend on visions of tomorrow. Technological progress depends on promises that do not yet exist. In a sense, civilizations are built by people staring across dark water toward distant lights. Yet every civilization inherits the same paradox. The future creates progress. The future also creates dissatisfaction. The more a culture worships what comes next, the harder it becomes to appreciate what already exists. And that consequence reaches far beyond literature. It shapes identities, relationships, economies, entire generations. A person begins postponing happiness until success arrives. A society begins postponing contentment until growth arrives. A civilization begins postponing meaning until some imagined future finally appears. The pattern repeats at every scale. From a single life to an entire culture. And suddenly another memory fragment comes into focus. Not the light itself. Not the hand reaching toward it. But the dark water between them. Because perhaps the most important symbol was never the destination. Perhaps it was the gap. The space where longing lives. The space where imagination operates. The space where human beings construct stories powerful enough to guide entire lives. And that realization leads to an even more unsettling possibility. What if the true mystery was never why people chase distant lights? What if the deeper mystery is why reality alone seems insufficient without them? Because if meaning depends on distance, if purpose depends on pursuit, and if identity depends on what remains just beyond reach, then the question is no longer whether the light is an illusion. The question becomes far more dangerous. What happens when a person finally discovers that the object of pursuit was never the source of meaning in the first place? Before this point, the question seemed to be about desire. About ambition. About the distance between a person and an imagined future. But the deeper we go, the more another possibility begins to emerge. What if the most important thing in this story is not the dream, not the pursuit, and not even the object being pursued? What if the real subject is meaning itself? This is the revelation hidden beneath all the other revelations. The distant light is not ultimately a symbol of a person, a goal, or a future achievement. It is a symbol of humanity's need to create meaning beyond immediate reality. That is why the image feels larger than the narrative surrounding it. It touches something fundamental. Human beings do not merely survive through food, shelter, and security. They survive through stories. Through imagined futures. Through visions that allow present sacrifices to feel worthwhile. The central figure in this story matters because he embodies that mechanism in its purest form. His role is not that of a successful man or a failed man. His role is that of a believer. A believer in the transformative power of a future vision. That belief shapes his identity. Directs his choices. Organizes his world. But here is the insight most people miss. The tragedy is not that the vision remains distant. The tragedy is that the vision was never designed to satisfy the deeper need it appeared to promise. Because meaning and fulfillment are not the same thing. Human beings often confuse them. Meaning comes from movement. Fulfillment comes from presence. Meaning points forward. Fulfillment exists now. And when people attempt to use future achievements to solve present existential questions, they create a burden no dream can carry. Suddenly the symbol begins to look completely different. The small green light across dark water is no longer merely an unreachable destination. It becomes a projection screen for every hope reality cannot immediately provide. The light glows because human beings keep feeding it significance. The water between observer and object becomes equally important. Not as an obstacle, but as a space where imagination operates. A hand reaching into darkness. A distant glow suspended beyond certainty. A future powerful enough to shape an entire life. These memory fragments endure because they reveal something about consciousness itself. We are creatures who transform distance into meaning. We take uncertainty and fill it with possibility. We take absence and turn it into purpose. That ability has created art, exploration, innovation, discovery, and civilization. Yet it has also created disappointment, restlessness, and endless dissatisfaction. The same mechanism produces both. That is the deepest contradiction. The force that elevates humanity is inseparable from the force that unsettles it. And now the scale expands beyond literature entirely. Every era creates its own version of the distant light. Ancient civilizations called it destiny. Religious traditions called it salvation. Economic systems call it prosperity. Modern culture often calls it success. The names change. The structure remains. Entire societies become organized around future promises. Entire generations learn to orient themselves toward horizons they may never fully reach. This is why the symbol survives while countless other literary images fade. It is not attached to one historical moment. It describes a permanent feature of human nature. The ultimate revelation is not that people chase illusions. It is that the human search for meaning may require something that always stays slightly beyond possession. And if that is true, then an even larger consequence begins to appear. If the same force that inspires greatness also guarantees perpetual longing, what kind of world do we create when entire cultures build their identities around chasing distant lights rather than understanding why they need them in the first place? If the deepest revelation is that human beings create meaning by reaching toward distant possibilities, then the next question is unavoidable: what is the cost of living that way? Because every source of meaning leaves a consequence behind. Not only in individuals, but in entire cultures. The most immediate consequence is psychological. When people organize their lives around a future ideal, the present begins to lose value. Ordinary moments become waiting rooms. Achievements become stepping stones. Relationships become milestones. Life itself becomes preparation for a life that has not yet arrived. That is the hidden cost. A person can spend years moving forward while feeling permanently unfinished. Not because they are failing. Because completion was never built into the system. The distant light keeps moving. The horizon keeps expanding. And the pursuit continues. This is why the image of a hand extending into darkness remains so powerful. It captures a condition that extends far beyond a single story. The hand is not merely reaching toward a goal. It is reaching toward a version of reality that always seems slightly more meaningful than the one already possessed. That tendency shapes identity. But it also shapes memory. People often remember their hopes more vividly than their accomplishments. They remember anticipation more intensely than arrival. The dream can become more emotionally significant than its fulfillment. And that creates a remarkable legacy. The central figure of this story leaves behind more than an individual example. He leaves behind a mirror. His influence endures because he reveals a pattern that millions of people recognize within themselves. Different ambitions. Different eras. Different circumstances. The same structure. The same distance. The same longing. A small light across dark water. A future glowing just beyond certainty. The legacy of the symbol is not literary. It is human. Now the scale expands again. What happens when entire societies begin operating according to the same pattern? Economic systems depend on future expectations. Educational systems promise future opportunities. Political movements promise future improvement. Technological innovation promises future transformation. The future becomes the organizing principle of civilization itself. This creates extraordinary progress. It also creates a permanent state of collective dissatisfaction. A culture that constantly looks ahead can become disconnected from what already exists. Growth becomes more important than contentment. Expansion becomes more important than presence. The next achievement becomes more important than the current reality. The consequence is subtle. People become surrounded by abundance while feeling deprived. Surrounded by opportunity while feeling incomplete. Surrounded by connection while feeling distant. The external conditions change. The internal structure remains. That may be why this symbol continues to resonate with modern audiences far more than many symbols from the same era. It anticipated a condition that has only become more visible with time. A world filled with endless horizons. Endless upgrades. Endless possibilities. And endless reasons to postpone satisfaction. Yet there is another side to the legacy. Without distant visions, much of what humanity values would never exist. Exploration requires imagination. Discovery requires belief. Creation requires a future worth pursuing. Remove the distant light completely, and something essential may disappear along with it. Which leaves us facing a paradox that remains unresolved. The force that creates restlessness is also the force that creates progress. The force that generates longing is also the force that generates purpose. The force that prevents arrival may be the same force that keeps humanity moving forward. And that leads to the final mystery. If the distant light is neither enemy nor savior, neither deception nor truth, then what exactly are we supposed to do with it? Do we learn to let it go? Do we continue chasing it? Or is wisdom found somewhere in between, in understanding the distance without becoming consumed by it? Perhaps that is why this image has never truly belonged to a single novel, a single era, or even a single interpretation. Most literary symbols eventually settle into meaning. They become understood, categorized, explained. This one never does. It continues to live because it reflects a question that human beings have never fully answered. Not a question about wealth, ambition, love, or success, but a question about how people create significance in a world where nothing arrives with meaning already attached. The small light across dark water remains unforgettable because it captures a moment that exists far beyond fiction. A person standing at the edge of what is known. A hand extending toward something that cannot be fully possessed. A horizon that remains visible precisely because it remains distant. These are not merely images. They are conditions of being human. And perhaps that is the final insight hidden beneath everything else. The symbol endures not because it tells us what to believe. It endures because it refuses to do so. It never offers certainty. It never declares whether longing is a strength or a weakness. It never resolves the tension between aspiration and contentment. Instead, it leaves that burden with us. Every generation encounters the same dilemma in a different form. One generation sees opportunity. Another sees status. Another sees technological progress. Another sees personal reinvention. The objects change. The structure remains. Human beings continue searching for something capable of transforming the present into a meaningful story. That search becomes part of our legacy. Not because it always succeeds, but because it shapes everything we build while trying. The remarkable thing is that the most lasting influence of this symbol is not what it says about desire. It is what it says about awareness. The figure reaching into darkness matters less than the observer who recognizes the gesture. The distant glow matters less than the realization that everyone carries some version of it within themselves. A future self. A perfect opportunity. A missing answer. A destination that seems capable of making everything finally make sense. And yet life rarely unfolds as a completed equation. Meaning is not neatly delivered at the end of pursuit. It appears in fragments. In movement. In relationships. In moments of recognition. In the ability to see both the light and the distance at the same time. Perhaps wisdom is not found in abandoning distant visions. Perhaps it is not found in surrendering to them either. Perhaps it begins when we understand that the horizon has always been both real and symbolic. Real enough to guide us. Symbolic enough to remind us that no external achievement can fully answer an internal question. That understanding may be the true inheritance left behind. Not a lesson. Not a warning. Not a promise. A perspective. One that continues to feel relevant because the modern world offers more horizons than ever before, and yet many people still find themselves asking the same ancient questions about fulfillment, purpose, and belonging. And so the image remains. Dark water. A distant glow. A hand reaching outward. Not because it explains the human condition, but because it reveals it. And perhaps the question that lingers after everything else has faded is not whether the light was ever meant to be reached. Perhaps the deeper question is this: if the things we chase give shape to our lives, then what ultimately matters more, the destination waiting in the distance, or the person we become while moving toward it?